Okay, let's start this first session. And just we will swap places between these two presentations because we need to get your presentation into the computer, right? You put it in, so it's already done? Okay, then we'll stay to the order. So, yes, we're running a bit late, so I'll just go along. My name is Ajana Bornemark. I'm a philosopher from Sweden, Södertörn University. And I will also be sharing this session, so now I have the difficult task of chairing myself, and we're already 7 minutes late, so I'll just run through this. I will talk about a part of a genealogy of reason and its impact on modern metric culture. And in this paper, I want to point toward how a series of changes in the concept of reason has prepared the way for modern quantifying way of thinking. This history is, of course, far too complex and multifaceted to even give a sketch of in 20 minutes or 15 minutes. So I will give attention to Nicholas of Cusa, who not only was part of this change, but who I also think can help us to explore how we understand and use quantifications and the concept of reason today. And also, I think he can help us to see some power struggles going on. I will hopefully quickly get to that towards the end. I will also just very quickly point towards a certain development within Descartes, who actually lived 200 years after Cusa. Cusa lived in the 15th century. And he was not only a philosopher, but also a theologian, mathematician, politician, and many other things, such as Renaissance people often were. But he's most known to this learned ignorance, which he explored specifically in the Docta Ignorantia, and I will work here on that. I will talk about that work together with De Conjecturis, which are the most central texts to my interest here. And not knowing today is very different from what Cusa presents, I think. Today, we might say that we understand not knowing as a missing piece in a puzzle already laid out, and a piece that we can find, something not yet known. As we, for example, fill in our research applications today, results, and even where the results should be published, should already be formulated, to mention a quick example of that. But in Cusa, not knowing is rather a horizon surrounding everything. It is, of course, the relation to the maximum, to the greatest infinite, as well as to the minima. And actually, I will try to quickly draw a map of Cusa's epistemology, just to give us an image of it. And these are the horizons of not knowing. And not knowing is then, of course, as I said, maxima here and minima here. And today we might misunderstand minima as the physical question for the smallest entity. Maybe today it's a string or something. But in Cusa, he emphasizes that the minima is rather the uniqueness of a certain situation, such as this, of an individual, that which can never be fully emptied through all our concepts, through all our generalizations. We can formulate and describe these situations in thousands of ways, and yet it will have a certain uniqueness that cannot be fully repeated. That's what he means by the minima. And also, of course, we have everything in relation to sense perception, which might be over there. And it is even though we have these horizons of not known and sense perception, that would be just the chaotic influence. We know that a small child has this all different sense perceptions, but we start to see similarities, start to generalize in order to create a world. But in that way, it's also part of an unknown. We can talk about the future as unknown. We can talk about the other person. When I look into someone's eyes, I see that I do not see. You hear I can dwell into this, but I will not. So, even though these horizons of not knowing are there is definitely in Cusa possible to build human knowledge. That is actually what we do as human beings. We dwell within these horizons and we build a world. We build a cosmos from out of this chaos. And one key concept for this then is ratio. Ratio deals with the material given through the senses. In itself, ratio itself, sense perception is chaotic, as I said. But ratio starts seeing similarities, starting to group things together, seeing one thing in many individuals at many occasions, starting to see structures, systems, and also proportions and connections between these different concepts. And this is the key move in order to understand what calculation is all about, because it is to see what one unit is. This one that I can, only if I understand what one is, I can start to have several of that kind. If I start to understand what a human being is, then I can count how many humans are there in here. So numbers are central, at the center of ratio. And this is the way we start to sort of categorize. And often we do that, of course, maybe in this more stiff patterns to build a world that we recognize, that we will come back to. Now I still have my breath up here. See if I can breathe within this paper somehow. Okay, so this is done, as you see, what is it to pick up? What to count? That's Kusa's question. He talks about that ratio actually relates to quiddity, whatness, quality, essence. What to count? That is not a given. That is something constantly sought for and formulated and lost and found again. So here we can of course only know, we need to know what a tree is in order to count them. We need to differ between a tree and a bush. We need to differ treeness from greenness. That would mean to count in a different way. It would mean to differ, to count what is alive or what has a certain shape. So within sense perception, we could draw the lines, we could catch these categories in all different kinds of ways. And what directs our gaze, I will come back to. But his key point is that we constantly need to do this. We need to find these countable whatnesses. So knowledge as pieces in a puzzle could be said to actually belong to ratio's way to understand the world. It is the ratio that defines these pieces in the puzzle, and the puzzle as not puzzle, the puzzle as such, only the pieces in the puzzle. To see how they belong together, and who thereby understands not knowing as not yet known. This might be an X there. And actually in research often we need to know so much, all the pieces around it, that, and we know exactly the shape of the knowledge we're looking for. We only don't know if that blue line is going that way or that way. That's the relation to not knowing. And science is of course here only an example. But there is also a problem with ratio, as the overflowing horizons and our sense perception is a constant flow, a constant change. The order is also imposed upon the changeable. So by means of mathematics, what is changeable becomes fixed and stable. Hear me right here. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm saying we need to do it. But life, and not least sense perception, is flexible, is moving. That means we need to come back there. We can't stay within one set of categories. We know how concepts move and dies, and maybe can be transformed or reawakened in different way. And that's why he formulates also this second part of rationality, and that is the intellectus in Latin. I will say intellect here. Actually, you could discuss here ratio. We do have it in rationality, of course, and intellect, and the intellection, etc. It's interesting what this means to us today. I will save that for another time. But the intellect is very different from ratio, even though the ratio is actually dependent upon it. No matter how much ratio calculates Kusa says. It will never arise to the intellect. But nevertheless, ratio is always already using the intellect in its relation to quiddity, in its relation to know what to count. So the intellect is always inherent in ratio, but ratio can't really see it from its own point of view. Maybe a Kierkegaardian leap or something would be needed here. And the intellect is our relationship and our judgment, our way to relate to these overflowing horizons. But as this, or on this limit, it has a certain sensitivity for quiddity. It perceives qualities in the sensible, in relation to the infinite and in relation to unique situations and individuals. And these quiddities are then treated by ratio, as I just described. And by apprehending quidditas, the intellect thus gives measurements or the tools to ratio. Just as the seeing of colors is not a color on its own, but of a higher order. Kusa actually has that example. So ratio can differ between different colors and relate them to each other, but the intellect perceives color as such, as a quality of reality within which we can perceive differences. Through the ratio, we can differ between white and black, hot and cold, sharp and unsharp, but these contraries are tied together in the intellect as light, temperature, and sharpness. So the intellect apprehends what keeps these two sides together. The intellect provides measurement, so the ratio can measure accordingly. And in relation to knowledge, in sensibility, we do not understand or perceive the subject-object form. When we are out here only sensing, we of course don't see the relation to sensibility as subject-object. And ratio understands subject-object as a dichotomy. But in the intellect, subject and object are understood as intertwined and mutually dependent in the process of gaining knowledge. So the intellect perceives that which ratio can calculate, but it also works the other way around. And here, here the intellect, and this is like the common reading of Kusa, and sometimes it has been misunderstood. This first part, not all Kusa researchers agree on, that the intellect is within the ratio, but that's because they don't read close enough. But, but the second part, that the intellect is a constant reflection upon the categories everyone would agree on. And what happens in that move is that you bring a category into relation to the not known in order to discuss, is this what is most, is this the whatness that is most important right now? Are these the right measurements? So, a question as, is there a God? Ratio would immediately like to answer yes or no. But the intellect would instead want to investigate the category of God and the category of is in order to understand how they are related, what kind of whatnesses these both concepts contain, and thus in what way maybe it can be said to be true and in what way it could be said to be false. So it sees complexity and that there are no simple definitions, that the definitions could be different, and that there might be a call for change as reality keeps moving on. It realizes that the definitions and categories of ratio does not exhaust sensibility, that there is always more in sensibility, and thus in each situation, than what can be caught by ratio at one point. Counting and measuring is, as we have seen, dependent upon already fixed units, and the intellect is thus also the self-reflection of this calculation. A reflection that shows the limits of calculation and where the one counting and her concepts and rules becomes visible and possible to change. It could always be different. Sensibility is always richer than our categories. I said that like 3 times now. So the intellect in this way relates to what we can not know. And how does it then, what is this sensibility on the edge here? Well, Kusa talks about a certain love or a certain desire of that which is not known, which is only seen vaguely or in the contours. It's a picking up on atmospheres. It's a faith, he talks on in a specific way, as not yet fully knowing, having this hunch, searching for something that you need to begin with, that you want to continue. So faith is here, and emotions and atmospheres, all these that we put often in contrast to reason, are here part of an intellect as the beginning of knowledge. If one, for example, want to gain scientific knowledge, we have to believe in the basic categories. Science gains its direction through faith, and faith gains through science its development. Where there is no faith, there is no knowledge. And we should know that in Kusa, there is a tension within this sort of epistemological concept of faith and a Christian concept of faith. So faith is thus, according to Kusa, among other things, consciousness's capacity for knowledge. But as it is not yet knowledge, it's also a certain relation to not knowing, which he, of course, understands as a divine. So the intellect thereby also gives ratio its founding direction and values through its own relation to that which cannot be known. See what is most important to say here. The intellect is thus also a judgment, judging the calculus. Is this reasonable? Are the categories the right ones? Are the measures right? What can we not reach through these categories? To what are we blind? Is this what we cannot measure? Is that important? But it is thereby also an act, as it changes the categories or how we treat them. And here, and I will skip this, but Kusa has a very complex position in the medieval discussions on universals. And in a way, it's important to our contemporary discussion on relativism, that it's not that you make up the quiddities. You don't, but it's not neither that they are in a Platonic world on its own. It is that you have a sensibility, you do pick up and you formulate them, and then something happens to them when they become stricter and stricter, measurable concepts for the ratio. So that's he has a very interesting and special understanding or position within this discussion on universals. So, just a very, very quick look at Descartes, who actually often functions as a scarecrow in contemporary philosophy, and I'm afraid that that's sort of the role I'm giving him here as well. But as this is part of a much bigger research project, I have much more nuanced readings of him there. Because what's interesting in Descartes is that he describes a certain step from this way of understanding reason. And he describes how the appearance of a new phenomena brings us into astonishment with that which is not known. He actually really describes in Passions of the Soul a relation to the horizons of not knowing. He is still a Renaissance person and maybe not a fully modern person. But his important point is that this place of astonishment, the place of intellectus in Kusa's concept, is not a place to dwell in. We always need to move as quickly as possible into a ratio where we can actually create a safe and controlled world. And his ethics actually breathes this, as he claims that the way to reach happiness is only to make oneself dependent upon that which is in control, that of which we are in control of. That is to kind of turn your back towards all these not knowings. That is definitely not in control. So, Descartes is thus preparing the way for modernity, the historical period that Max Weber characterized as the time when everything should be possible to know. That is, what we do not know is only not yet known. That's important to Weber. And this knowing is performed by a self-ensured cogito who has knowledge about a res extensa, matter as pure extension. And the important thing of this move in Descartes is that this matter is fully measurable and does not go beyond the calculating ratio. So the measurable, for him, that is a safe place. At this is fully calculable, fully in control, or possible to control, never controlled, only possible to control by ratio. And cogito then, as a substance in Descartes, through modernity, becomes more and more something or reduced into res extensa itself. So I will sum up. Our understanding of reason and of the intellect has become, I would say, simplified since Cusa's 15th century, leaving only a calculating capacity, misunderstanding sides as the intellect would understand, and today we reduce them into emotion and faith as something on its own. And ratio thus creates dichotomies. What was told together in Cusa's reason is separated in modernity. This creates a rift between objectivity and subjectivity, reason, emotion, knowledge, and faith. And here then I could have two endings of this paper, or it could be developed in two different ways. One pointing at the continual genealogy of our understanding of reason, as the distinction between ratio and intellectus could be seen as transformed into Kant's distinction between Verstand und Vernunft. And these things are deeply discussed in the 19th century, as well as it might be understood as marking the difference between positivistic theory of science and hermeneutics, to explain and to understand, etc. But it also provides us with a more political tool, where we can investigate contemporary society and see how ratio-focused activities get a certain power and gets a certain role in relation to intellectus-focused activities. We could, for example, claim that art and humanistics and social sciences emphasizes the intellect, which is given less value than sciences of strict measurability. In a culture of measurability, of course, the calculating ratio is predominant above the field of intellect. So that's it. Thank you. So I will take a few minutes for questions as I started.
Sorry, if you leave the questions right at the end.
Okay.
Have it as a panel.
Sure.
Yeah, that would be
Sure.
probably better. Thank you. And if you please could put on this so that it's better volume for the recording. Thank you very much. I'll just put it on. There we go.
Thanks. The presentation is where?
Yes, I put it on my stick, so it will be.
And maybe I can quickly say who we are looking at now. We're looking at Andreas Hepp from the University of Bremen. He's preparing his presentation. And the title here will be A Transnational Spread of an Idea, the History of the Quantified Self Movement as a Pioneer Community.
Okay, thank you very much. Great to be here. As you see, I changed the title a bit with the main title, The Making of the Pioneer Community, using the term making in a double sense. First of all, it is a history about how the quantified self-movement as a certain kind of pioneer community came up, but also about the making of this community in the sense of how it tried to influence the field we are talking here about at this conference. If you look at the field of research on what is mainly called quantified self or self-measuring, you see, or you can notice that most of research is either focused on practices, on things like gamification, health and the body, or surveillance and control. What is less focused from my point of view is research on the pioneer community quantified self itself. So this group of people who tried to push that idea starting in the Bay Area. And this is exactly the focus of my presentation here today, the quantified self movement, as they call themselves, and as you might know, present themselves in the webpage. What I want to present you here today is research coming from one research project called Pioneer Communities. It's not only focused on the quantified self movement, but compares the quantified self movement with another movement which had also its origins in the Bay Area in San Francisco, around San Francisco, and this is the Makers Movement. And both of these movements started around the same time and had a quite deep influence on our present cultures as far as they relate to media and technologies. In core, the outline of my presentation is a three-step argument which focuses on three different phases of the development of this pioneer community. First of all, what I want to call an anchor of tech journalism. This is how it started. Then it became a community of reasoning. This is at first, as they call it themselves. And finally, at present, they are in a situation where they want to develop what they call prototyping institutions. So looking back at the beginning, which was around 2007, what we call quantified self-movement started, if you talk with people who were involved in the beginning, as what I call journalistic approach. So the main figures behind that, Gary Wolf and Kevin Kelly, were journalists at Wired. And they introduced or developed the term because they had a feeling that using this term, they can bring together different kinds of thinking relating to personal computing. And the idea in the beginning was to use this term as a journalistic enterprise. So build around this term certain kinds of stories to reflect what's going on with personal computing around this time. Especially Gary Wolf, he had some personal experiences with personal computing when he tried to learn Spanish as a foreign language. And this exactly resulted in the idea to have a first meetup in 2007. So the idea was to collect at that meetup different kinds of people who are involved in that way of personal computing. It took then place in 2008 in the private home of Kevin Kelly. At this first meeting, there were around 20 to 25 participants. It's not exactly possible to reconstruct this anymore. But the core point here is, if you look at these participants, highly influential persons took already part of it. So beside others, it was Seth Roberts, a professor of psychology at the University of California. He already died at this time. He was emeritus. And he's very much involved in self-experimentation and brought this idea into the discourse from the beginning. Tim Ferriss is maybe better known. So it's an author of, books about personal development and self-improvement. And finally, Steve Dean, who is working at a product development company and design office in New York and who became a first important node of this network. The outcome, which is mainly known from this first meeting, is an article by Gary Wolf in which he introduced this idea of the quantified self-movement. So when he made this journalistic idea reality, it was a first positioning as pioneers, how they called themselves. And especially they emphasized on not being focused on individualistic approaches. The idea in the beginning was to share data, to collaborate, and to build up a certain kind of community. So the focus in the beginning was, to sum up at this point, an anchoring of a certain discourse about hyper-personal computing, as spread in the beginning only in the Bay Area and New York, with a very close group of journalists and scientists and tech enthusiasts, and a certain institutionalization with personal blogs and selected tech articles around Wired. Local meetups took place in private homes and locations. What started very quickly is what I call themselves, looking backwards, as a community of reasoning. In 2009, there came up the idea that the format which was developed at these first meetups might also work at bigger conferences. So they introduced the idea to have a bigger conference in the Bay Area, which took then place. And already there, Martin Aslander was one participant coming from Amsterdam and introducing at this first idea already the idea to build up a link to Europe and to develop that conference, which then became the European Quantified Self Conference. So the main node, the main node in Europe was Amsterdam, short after that Groningen, where we have nowadays the Quantified Self Institute, less when you compare it, for example, to the Makers Movement, London and Berlin. I think you all know about these Quantified Self conferences, at least if you're interested in that field. The interesting thing at this Quantified Self conference, at least from my point of view, that they again and again have a certain session where they explain how to build up meetups. And if you look more in detail, you can notice that the cities where the largest meetup groups are the cities where these conferences take place. So these conferences have an important role to build up this pioneer community transnationally. What happened also is that Quantified Self became a trademark, how Wolf called it, an unenforced trademark. So the idea is not to use this trademark to sell a certain kind of product, but to have a certain kind of control over the discourse around the Quantified Self. So whoever uses this term has to communicate back to Gary Wolf, and by this they can handle, at least this is their imagination, somehow the discourse around this term. It is a trademark, which is of course also used for the Quantified Self conferences. And from the internal point of view, what they try to link with the Quantified Self movement are what they call three worlds. This is first of all the tech world, second the world of science, and third the world of personal development. More from a scientific point of view, you can argue it is a group of people consisting out of journalists, users, developers and researchers, which are mainly focused on defining what they call media, so these technical devices, more from the perspective of temporal affordances, temporal rules and temporal algorithms. So here you have a much deeper process thinking on what media are, as you would have when you focus on everyday users. It was also the moment with an emerging public discourse about the Quantified Self movement, starting with tech magazines, so Wired, for example, but also other tech magazines like CT in Germany. The German media started with a wider coverage about this movement 2012. And you have a quite fast shift of discourse. So the beginning was a focus on an extraordinary group of people. Then it became reflected as a more general phenomenon. The focus was, at least in the internal view of this pioneer community, and focus on reasoning about the practices of self-tracking, a spread then from North America to Europe, with the main cities as nodes, and then low institutionalization with the web pages and conferences in a very small privately financed office in Berkeley. The most interesting point of view when it comes to the present is the question how they want to guarantee a certain kind of sustainability. And there they have the idea to develop what they call prototyping institutions. So if you look at the process of institutionalization in the beginning, it was a quite low level one. What takes now place is the attempt to build up something we might call quasi-scientific institutions. The model which is behind there is science, at least in the perspective of the main players of the Quantified Self movement. So they use scientific models as an idea. And their idea is to build up a certain kind of journal, which they started with one prototyping special issue of methods of information in medicine. Beside that, they started a process of building up what they call research institutions. So, for example, the Quantified Self Institute at Groningen, which is related to the University of Groningen there, and which is defined as a prototype for possible future institutions. And finally, there's the idea behind there to have an education program. That means to educate people in the frame of the Quantified Self movement. I want to skip this and come to the conclusion to be in the time. So what you see, and this is for me the interesting point when it comes to the historical development of the Quantified Self movement, an ongoing process of institutionalization, which explains partly the deep influence which they also have in politics. So if you look, for example, at the governments here in Europe, we can take partly Germany as an example, but also other countries, for example, in the US, the former US government. This group of people had a quite deep influence in consulting certain ideas when it comes to health, healthcare, and so on and so on. So they organized in the beginning conferences and meetings with these kinds of people, and by this were able to develop or to communicate the idea of the quantified self movement also beyond the sphere of everyday users and beyond the sphere of tech enthusiasts to politics. Partly this explains, at least from my perspective, or relates from my perspective, to the shift of public discourse about that pioneer community, which less and less relates to them as a certain special kind of group of people and more understands them as something which could be understood for general developments of our present cultures and societies. This institutionalization also explains the stability of this pioneer community across countries and the influence on public discourse across countries. If we go back to the internal perspective of that pioneer community, I want to end with another quote by Gary Wolfe, who said in an interview I had with him, what if the meaning of the quantified self in terms of locus of control remains ambiguous for another 25 years? From my point of view, this quote is interesting because of two reasons. First of all, it represents the timing these people are thinking. So it is really an enterprise they imagine, they can develop over decades. And if you talk with them, maybe over 100 years, this is the imagination. On the other side, this quote represents the highly unsure situation in which they feel themselves. So the insecurity if this movement might remain, which again explains the attempt to build up this different kind of institutions. Thank you.
So, first off, thanks for having us here. I'm Eric Nui, and I'm here to introduce you to our research project, Taxonomies of the Self, which is funded by the German Research Association for 3 years since September 2015, in which I participate with Professor Uwe Wormbusch and Dr. Karin Kappler. So, and we are from the University of Hagen, obviously. So I want to discuss two theses. First, we see self-tracking as a further step in a history of expanding calculative practices. So I will begin by lining out previous steps on the next slide. And after that, we will look at our second thesis. Here we state that self-trackers generate something new, something very special, namely collective orders of worth for everyday activities, for competences which are related to the body and its history. So self-tracking can be understood as a global laboratory in which people render their concrete differences categorized and comparable by developing techniques and normative criteria. So from its very beginnings, modern capitalism has been constitutively linked to the field of calculation. The genesis of modern capitalism depended on the innovation of double-entry bookkeeping. For Max Weber and Werner Sombart, accounting played a crucial role in enhancing capitalist rationality. They stated that the Protestantic idea of a mundane proof of value would lead to a specific rationalization of conduct of life. Especially Sombart stressed that this implied a calculative handling of sins. In this sense, moral bookkeeping can be seen as a systematic accountability in front of God. Thus, following Aho, we can interpret the double-entry bookkeeping not only as informational tool for bankers and merchants, but as a cultural technique in which the idea of balance in fortune and debt is inscribed. In a similar vein, you can interpret human resource management as what Uwe Wormbusch called social calculation, a twofold attempt of an objectifying balancing and a subjectifying unfolding of values, which are fundamental to contemporary capitalism. Human resource management isn't just a process of evaluating work potentials preemptively, but it follows the claim to assist with ethical decisions about the development of individual skills and capacities. In modern capitalism, you could say with Moldash, subjectivity is the fuel, not longer the brakes. Since the 1990s, the then calculative tools like new public management or international education comparisons like PISA have gradually expanded into not yet economized fields such as education and health. So now, in contrast to previous stages, not only markets, organizations, and systemic processes are the object of calculative assessments. Today, subjects themselves have already begun to develop new practices of a quantified self-observation. But rather than being confronted with specific religious ethical demands, today's individualized societies have quite the contrary issue, namely the need to create and stabilize ethical lifestyles which are at least in principle open. We even witnessed the partial erosion of reliable self-institutions like, for example, the normal biography by now, and subjects are now confronted with the task to find the very criteria for succeeding identities by themselves. On the other hand, capitalist economies change fundamentally. These changes imply the imperative to calculate and to control forms of capital, which are equally immaterial as they are bound up with the subjects themselves. Therefore, increasing uncertainty about the value of goods can be regarded as a manifestation and a fundamental shift in the value basis of contemporary capitalism. If individual as well as collective knowledge are in the center of today's economies, from a functional viewpoint, taxonomies are needed which are able to frame and calculate living subjectivity. But because new forms of valuation cannot be simply derived from functional requirements, and because the economic background is important, but at the same time there's more to it than just economy, the valuation studies are so important. For them, valuation is often considered as a practical doing and knowing how. Characteristic for such studies is the analysis of processes through which something that stands normally outside the market becomes now attributed an economic value. Valuation is a multifold social practice which perforates and shifts the margins between economy and culture. Drawing on this conceptual background, we look after such practices of valuation by which the self, its living body, and everyday world are calculated and governed. We do this from two angles. Economically, as the valorization of hitherto unvalued and non-accessible aspects of selfhood. Culturally, as a means to cope with the norm not only to be oneself, that is to be authentic, but to discover ever more aspects of oneself. Thus, we see self-tracking as fundamentally ambivalent. On the one hand, self-inspection might imply options of self-knowledge and emancipation, and could be called, in this sense, enabling accounting. On the other hand, it threatens to subject every aspect of individual life by extending instrumental rationality to hitherto uncalculable entities, the living body, the self, emotions, desires. So, we draw from the sociology of critique and the strongly related economy of conventions, short EC. The EC asks for those qualities which precede any kind of economic trade or social coordination. Conventions make the comparability of beforehand uncomparable objects and persons possible. Thereby, the EC shares with valuation studies the belief in a plurality of regimes of worth. So, in many fields, conventions have to prove themselves, are often criticized, but in the field of self-tracking, we can observe the social creation and of the preconditions which allow classifications in the first place. Here we can observe conventions in the making. Looking for conventions, two issues are central. How do actors justify their actions relating to general categories and schemes of judgment, and how do they coordinate their actions? So on QS websites, you can often read that self-tracking is about self-knowledge through numbers, but self-knowledge and numbering aren't enough to establish orders of worth which different groups of actors acknowledge. It needs further specifications about what self-trackers want to know more about, which criteria and notions of eligibility they use to evaluate this knowledge, and their actions of what range and stability self-tracking technologies are and which social spheres these practices are valid. So I brought some empirical examples to illustrate our claims. Although we think the QS movement had a special role in the generation of taxonomies, we also look at everyday self-trackers as well as developers of self-tracking apps. But for this talk, I brought very recent data of a participant observation we did with diet tracking bodybuilders. We invited them to cook on our expenses, videotaped them doing so, talked to them, and had a group discussion following the meal. So since I guess we will see many examples of self-tracking technologies in the next days, I'll make this one short. Here you see a picture of the apps our bodybuilders were using, namely Food Database on the left, in the middle My Fat Secret, and on the right MyFitnessPal, which they lined up to show us that they do pretty much the same and in this sense are very standardized. So our bodybuilders said that the decision about which app you use is basically which one you downloaded first. This may demarcate diet tracking from, for example, mood tracking, which seems to us far less standardized. But while our bodybuilders just used their smartphones for tracking, you can find complex assemblages if you look, for example, at other sportsmen. An Ironman athlete uses pulse, heart rate variability, VO2 max, watt, speed and distance, and many more. So other materialities we encountered were inaccuracies with sweat or battery life or even fashion. So one of our bodybuilders didn't want, he sold his Fitbit because he said he just wanted to wear other watches and his smartphone can do the same job. So, but these were technological criteria our interviews organized their equipment with. Let's look at how they justified their tracking in general. So we have the feeling that self-tracking mostly assembles around three fields: performance, health, and emotion. Maybe you could add aesthetics or some kind of playfulness. We hold this as an open question. In any case, these aspects are not meant to be exclusive. More often than not, they are overlapping. Our bodybuilders justified their tracking with the ambition to reach the natural maximum of muscle without taking drugs, like other bodybuilders, like they say. While indicators for strength are the weights they lift as well as their body mass, controlling your weight can be seen as a precondition for success. You have to gain weight to gain muscle and lose weight to define your muscles. To do this, they monitored their calories by pen and paper in the past, but self-tracking adds simplicity to this process, as they say, so they welcomed this very much. Additionally, they embraced the flexibility of live feedback because as they know their calorie balance anytime, they don't have to stick to fixed diet plans like earlier, and they can adjust their diet to immediate needs. They call this flexible dieting. I want to contrast this with another diet tracker who wanted to monitor a change in her diet, and she would object that notion of flexibility because the goals and affordances inscribed in those apps didn't work out for her. It didn't match her belief of how you should eat. She said, I learned that something happens regarding nutrition and listening to your body, that it doesn't work if you focus on numbers and let the program decide or suggest that it's too little or that something lacks. And I have learned something which I had learned with some difficulty, listening to what my body needs and when it's too much and stuff like that. So if the app told her to eat more or less, it was stressful for her since it didn't match her notion of a good relation between her body and her nutrition. For the bodybuilders, on the other hand, their notions of strength and control, self-tracking integrated very well into already existing practices. But aside such fundamental concerns, tracking practices can vary in ambiguous ways too. Depending on the current goal, the rigor of the tracking varied notably of our bodybuilders. In deficit phases for fat loss, they try to track everything about the calorie denseness of an onion. But on the other hand, in surplus phases for muscle gain, they are much more disregardful, as it doesn't really matter for him if they gain 2 or 3 kilograms. It is interesting to see how they track every bit of their meal, but then they tell you that they just estimate their workout. One of the bodybuilders said that fresh stuff like broccoli only have like 50 calories, but you can weigh it quickly anyway. We called this broccoli conundrum because since on the one hand he counts every calorie he puts into his body, but it doesn't matter for him if his workout had like 170 or 230 calories burned. In this regard, later the bodybuilders justified this ambivalence with cost-benefit considerations, because while it's easy for them to scan any food bag, a pulse sensor, for example, during workouts didn't help enough with the accuracy of their estimates. So in the end, they say workout is a very small part of your daily activity anyway, and the general activity like walking is tracked by their smartphone, which is good enough. You have to see that they burn like 5,000 to 8,000 calories a day. So in diet tracking, we can find a twofold translation process where something gets translated into numbers, and where inaccuracies occur, and which, like in this case, may be imbalanced. There are performative adaptations to such translation issues. For example, diet trackers very often avoid having meals in restaurants or like cafeterias because they can't weigh the ingredients there, or they begin to eat more ready-made food because it's easy to scan those bags or frozen foods. Finally, there could be performative adaptations with ingredients themselves. What we see on this picture is the bar egg, which is invented for gastronomy, so they can always serve egg slices of the same size. I guess it would be pretty useful for self-tracking. Speaking of gastronomy, this isn't a player we could find concerned with self-tracking issues yet, but you can find a plurality of different groups, many startups, and some big players like Nike or Fitbit. But even smaller groups like our bodybuilders are related to and reach out to other groups, actors, social spheres. As a group, they distinct themselves, like I said, from other bodybuilders who use drugs to gain muscles. So they outline self-tracking as an effective alternative to drugs. Also, they have ethical considerations concerning other groups, for example, people using other methods of losing weight. They try to inform people on the internet about scientific results, about workout and dieting and how to alter routines. But they got somewhat frustrated from this and told us that they believe that people actually don't really want to lose weight. That people, they say, actually want a scapegoat which they can blame just to blame something. So in consequence, one participant said that in an ethical sense, he doesn't think that it's right that fat people with lacking will should get pumps which get food out of your stomach. They just should pull themselves together. So they foster a notion of strong will and self-responsibility and propagate certain methods and discredit other methods. In the end, we will see how things evolve, but history suggests that we will see more standardization efforts and an increasing dominance of big players like corporations or maybe health insurances. And with this, freedom of choice could shift into some kind of social and institutional coercion. But let me wrap this up for a moment. These self-trackers are examples for the expansion of what we call corporeal accounting. The quantification of the body and the intimate centers on discourses about performance, health, and emotions, which doesn't mean that we find homogeneous criteria there. Instead, we've seen ambiguities concerning the two-fold translation process of things into numbers, including performative adaptations. We have seen negotiations about what criteria are right and what notions of eligibility. This can be about moral and ethical decisions or concerns, or just about the right indicators you should use. We have seen varying materialities and so on. When asked about the future, all of our interviewers suspected that self-tracking would further diffuse into society. So one of our bodybuilders said, if people understand that it's way easier to do this single-handedly with a tool that helps monitor it, then it will boom for sure. Concerning our second thesis, our bodybuilders justified their tracking with ethical issues concerning drugs, as well as simplicity and flexibility, in contrast to pen and paper methods and fixed diet plans. But as I tried to show you, with the contrasting examples, such criteria are contested and negotiated. We have also seen our bodybuilders didn't do just tracking for themselves, but also try to get in touch with other groups, share their insight and philosophies. So self-tracking isn't just about individual issues. Like double-entry bookkeeping, corporeal accounting isn't just an informational tool, but also a cultural technique. We can observe negotiations about orders of worth, which are related to our cultural and economic life, and will retroact in the process of social generalization. In short, we can witness orders of worth in the making. Thank you very much. Our contacts. We have some stuff in German, but this is our only English literature. And thanks.
Great. So comments, questions for all of the presentations?
Should I use the microphone?
Thank you for your presentations. This question is for Andreas. Actually, it has two parts, my question. So first one is about the institutionalization part. So basically, you are describing in a quite linear way that first there was a Quantified Self conference, and now there's an institute, and there's going to be an N of 1 journal, and this is a way to kind of continue the work. But pioneers are not all moving to the same direction. So what I actually see is various kinds of knowledge practices emerging in the field of occupational health or digital health development. It might be smart insurance. It might be smart cities. So that's kind of one comment. Then the other one is why is N of 1 quasi-scientific? Because it's actually, there's already articles in Science where N of 1 methodology is being used. So how do you understand the quasi part in Science?
Okay, the first part of your question. So I think the main point is what you're talking about. Yeah? If you're talking about a general field of self-measurement and so on, yes, it is very diverse. For me, the interesting thing is that you have, and this is for what I would reserve the term quantified self only. You have this specific group of people. It is a quite close network of people collaborating with each other, exchanging with each other, knowing each other very well, and working closely together with each other for now 10 years. And this is what I'm interested in, especially here. Comparing it with what they call makers movement, from my point of view, both of them are not movements in the sense of a social movement. They are something else. This is the reason why we use that term pioneer community. It's more a kind of mixture between movement and think tank, especially because of the link of both. Partly to politics, partly to industries, and so on and so on. And what they have is, in a certain sense, a long-term strategy. Yes, both. The interesting thing is that they do it very differently, while you have at the maker movement much more kind of franchising approach. So they build it up a company which holds the maker's brand and cooperate with other companies, and so on and so on. This is the way how they try to keep their influence in this complex field you're talking about. If you're talking about doing your self-practice, it's also a very, very diverse field. But within that field, you have this maker movement still related to maker media. And you have something comparable within the wide field of self-measurement. And it is interesting from my point of view, first of all, how they try to keep influence and how they partly manage this. This has something to do with processes of building up institutions, and it is. And there's a difference from my point of view if you compare the maker movement with the quantified self movement. Yes, this is much closer to science. From the beginning, much more scientists were involved in this with a certain kind of orientation and so on, self-experimentation and things like that. And relation to journals, that's the difference. But from my point of view, what I'm generally interested in is the wider research question is how across different cultures, these kind of technologically related ideas become communicated and become stabilized. And there you can see certain kinds of patterns. At least this is what we are trying to work out. So what we are doing at present is really to build up an analysis of the core networks, to get interviews with all core actors, and to get by this a deeper insight what happened, also politically. So what happened with politically oriented conferences, with consulting, and so on and so on. And there's much more happening in the background than you can see if you have a look at a quantified self web page, for example. This is the first part of first half of your question. The second was, could you remind me, please? Okay, this is, well, partly answered. So main parts of them are not scientists. They even don't have a PhD. But they have the idea to use a certain kind of link to universities, to research institutions of keeping their ideas in life and developing them. That's the reason why I put that quasi before, in brackets. So part of them are scientists, yes, of course, and they are established. If you look at some of the journals of this first journal, they are co-editing now. Yes, part of them. But the core idea is to have a journal which is partly beyond science in the established sense, because the reason or the argument they have is that certain forms of self-experiments are not accepted yet for regular science. And they really want to push this forward. This is the internal point of view, and this is the reason why they make a quite clear distinction between what is established science on the one hand and what is their project, which goes beyond this. They really want to extend that view, and they have the idea that they can do it.
I have a question behind. Wait.
Oh, Andreas, I wanted to again pick up that question about institutionalization of quantified self and the degree to which it's a kind of intentional approach. Because yes, N of 1 is something that Gary had started as part of a kind of larger project with the Woodward Johnson Foundation, from what I understand, but the institute in Amsterdam is a kind of standalone institute that sought out affiliations with quantified self as a kind of credentialing source. But from your experience, in what way are they part of this kind of broader narrative of it almost kind of happened as a aftermath in a sense, and quantified self now, the community participates in that.
So the core idea we have is really to reconstruct that network. And the link to Amsterdam and by that to Groningen was there from quite the beginning, from the first Quantified Self conference in the Bay Area. This is how the link was built up. If you look at the Quantified Self Institute in Groningen, one of the key figures there invited there was Gary Wolf when there was the opening. And of course, they cooperate each other just to use the brand Quantified Self. This is what I try to explain with it is a kind of trademark. Yes, it's legally secured, but not with the idea to make money out of it, like you know from other brands, but with the idea to keep the discourse linked with each other and to build on an ongoing way by this the network of people. So this would be my answer to your question.
Okay.
Great. Thanks very much. So it strikes me that something binding all of your papers is the role of not knowing, and sort of the specter of the unknown, which is seen as the enemy of control, right? And the quantified self movement, and I'm sure the apps and hardwares we'll hear about in the coming days. They're ways of wrestling back control, taking back control, with the goal of gaining knowledge of who we are, of what we do, because if we know who we are and what we do, then maybe we'll act differently, right? So these are mechanisms that these devices, these softwares presuppose will make us, through making our activities known and measured, it'll make us behave differently. Yet we have the entire field of behavioral economics, which suggests humans are not rational beings, right? We are thoroughly irrational. And we know, and we saw in Eric in your paper, just how flawed some of these metrics might be. So I wonder if you could, any of you, all of you, might say something about this project of making humans a bit more rational, or this goal of making humans rational through technological solutionism and sort of its deficits, perhaps.
Maybe. I as might be clear, I see it as part of the modern project, and it's a shift in faith from faith in God, which is in Kusa, it is the unknown per se, and the faith in calculation itself, and a faith, and because it's really a faith, right? And it's a faith and a hope for control. So you can also see it in parallel to religious movements. They often claim to be the opposite, but certain structures are very similar. And this is, of course, also a way to see also, of course, in human beings, I mean, from a philosophical point of view, there's always a search for control and, of course, finding the knowledge in order to build a world that you want to live in, of course. But there is a very, very different way to kind of relate to that which happens, that which cuts in outside of your control, and as you say, which always influences our worlds, our lives. And if the aim is to, well, that is what God gives us in a more traditional medieval way. You shouldn't even try to control it. Or as Weber formulates it, that we just don't know yet. So I would say you can see it in that way, at least, as two ways to kind of handle human lives. More questions on this side? I think there's another comment. Yes.
So, our everyday self-trackers, I wouldn't see them striving for rationality in some kind of total sense. Often they just want to change something, to monitor something, or to keep something. And they're doing this by kind of a twofold process. So they look at those numbers, but then if it's enough, they stop their tracking, and they do 2 weeks without tracking, then they shift back because they get away from their practices. And so they don't want to have everything under the rationalization of numbers. They just want to be on the right track, and that's it. So, and for others, there's an inner negotiation between, okay, should I eat this, or no, my well-being is much more important than the numbers that are telling me I shouldn't eat this. But maybe I learned that I shouldn't eat croissant because that's so fatty and so much calories. I could eat 3 like breads for this or something. So yeah, it's not everything about rationality in those practices.
Hi, my name is Tali Hadjakis from Open University. I wanted to ask, generally, if you think as self-tracking, not quantified self, I use my words carefully, self-tracking, as it becomes more mainstream, do you think something of the essence of the quantified self as a community is kind of shifting, and it loses its essence, you know, as it becomes more mainstream? Because it seems to me that we are talking about two completely different things under the same umbrella.
But yes and no. I think they are related. So what we did do is also research with groups of people who are just everyday self-trackers, and they're partly linked to this discourse. So they know this discourse about the quantified self partly via the media. Well, if they're interested in, they read web pages and so on and so on. Partly they had a look at what they are doing. But one result of our empirical research in that point was that there is you can make a distinction between two kinds of self-trackers. So one kind of self-trackers who are really enthusiastic about that, also with a technological dimension, and there they have a quite closer link in the sense that they are more oriented to this overall discourse about the quantified self. The other kind of self-trackers, they are pragmatic. These were the ones you talked about. They want to solve a problem. They have certain kinds of disease, problems with sleep, they want to have a certain diet, and so on and so on. And this is very much problem-oriented, and there is less a link. So this is how I would see the link between both.
Questions to each other in the panel? I mean, for me, it's interesting because from what I'm finding in my empirical research is that not many people actually know about the quantified self, like the everyday user. So when I ask them, like in my surveys and my interviews, did self-tracking make you aware of the existence of a community as such called quantified self? I would say more than 90% said no. And it struck me because I thought it was the quantified self that actually had spread this practice of self-tracking, but it doesn't seem the case, at least in my findings. So that's really interesting.
The point is what means spread. I think we must break with this idea that one group has a direct influence on one user. This is like, well, in media communications research in the beginning. What happens from my point of view is something different. Yes, it was this group which started a lot and which has from the beginning a certain kind of power when it comes to discourse. These were journalists of the main important tech magazine at this moment of time worldwide, where all the other tech journalists were looking at. So they started a certain kind of discourse when it was this journalistic enterprise, which widely opened up the field of thinking. And beside that, they started quite early, at least in the US, to collaborate also with the government, to have a conference there and to communicate the discourse by that. You have comparable patterns also in other European countries, and I think this is how the influence came up. So mediated via public discourse, via a shift of thinking. If you look back 10 years and you would talk about 10 years what the people are nowadays doing with these devices, there would be really a very critical, or would have been a very critical public discourse at that moment of time. And so what I see really here is a continuous shift about the public thinking, which is possible or which is acceptable by that technologies. And if you go, for example, to quantified self-conferences, or if you talk with this group of people, their fantasies about self-measurement are already far beyond what the everyday user does at present. And the question will be, what kind of these imaginations might become reality maybe in 5, maybe in 10 years, and what not? Of course, this is highly mediated, but they ongoingly try to push the thinking in that area. And well, maybe saying something critical about health in that area. From my point of view, health is very interesting because health is very often an argument to make things possible. If you say it is good for health, it helps people who have a problem, you can introduce quite easily a technology which merges with the body and so on and so on. And as soon if this is accepted in a certain kind of area, why shouldn't we do this also beyond health, just for personal self-improvement and so on and so on? So I think these are the patterns which are taking place there.